Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. My name is Sebastian Beck with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I would just like to welcome you all and just indicate that we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes, the time for everyone to enter this virtual room. So thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion on loss and damage and the COP-26 in particular from a human rights perspective. All right, perfect. It is 2 minutes past, so I would suggest that we start progressively. My name is Sebastian Beck from the Center of International Environmental Law, and I'm very grateful to all of the panelists, but also all of you participants who are joining us for this discussion today. We are very grateful to have Tetet Lauren, who is going to facilitate the meeting, so I will introduce her and hand her the word for the rest of the meeting in just a few seconds, but I wanted to highlight the context for the organization of this webinar. Normally, I will have focused on the next steps, but actually, I'd like to look back at something very remarkable that happened on Friday. We saw at the UN Human Rights Council, the supreme body at the United Nations, if you want, for human rights issues, actually the adoption of a resolution that recognizes the universal right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is a very important step in strengthening the human rights frameworks at the international level on this very important issue. So this is something that I believe now we are all looking forward to kind of building on and making sure that actually policies are oriented with this objective of fulfilling these universal rights. And in addition, we actually saw the establishment of a new post for UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change just last Friday. So hopefully also one more important, powerful voice very soon will be here to support the voice of those who are in the front lines, in addition to many of us who have done so far, including Professor Boyd, who is with us today. In terms of moving forward, I just wanted to highlight that this webinar is one of a series that we are organizing with experts and partners on critical human rights issues that are going to be considered at the COP. We just had one in relation to public participation this morning, and we're expecting to host one, at least more, on Article 6 and human rights issue for the COP-26. So what we'll do is we will share, we are recording the different webinars, and we will be sharing the recording of the three, or maybe a fourth one. We are considering also organizing one on ambition. We will share the recording from all webinars to all of the participants who are registered for this conversation. So if your partners, colleagues, or if you cannot attend the entire duration of today's discussion, we will definitely get you the video. And without any additional words from me, I'd like to hand the floor now to Tetet. Tetet is an advisor for the UN program at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And she's also a senior climate justice lead at ActionAid. She's been a very long time advocate on a very broad range of issues, both on rights-related advocacy, but also with a very strong focus on climate change. So it's our privilege to have Tetet actually agreeing to moderate this discussion today. And I wish you a very productive conversation. Thank you so much to all of you.
Hello, dear friends, and thank you very much, Seb, for the invitation and the honor of moderating this awesome panel. And I can really sense now that we are still very high from last Friday's announcement, because it was really a major, major announcement that we should really try and find how to optimize, for our advantage. And I can see Dr. Boyd already giving a thumbs up. So, as you mentioned, our webinar for today aims to, help folks preparing for COP26, and together with the earlier webinar on public participation and another one coming up on Article 6, we have a 3-part series that people could always refer to when they go into that COP bubble. Yeah. So for today, we are going to focus on loss and damage, and we have a very, very expert panel with us today to shed light, to give us a brief background on what is loss and damage, what are the crunch issues at the moment, how human rights organizations can help those leading this advocacy. And we'd also like to zero in, a specific focus on what is at stake at COP26 in the context of loss and damage. Okay, so I'll be introducing our expert panel today, but I will also be asking them specific questions later on. Okay, so let me start off with Dr. David Boyd, who is our UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So Dr. Boyd is also Associate Professor of Law, Policy, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia, and he was formerly an Executive Director of Eco-Justice. Next in our panel is my good friend Hafij Islam Khan, who is Director for the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh. Hafij is an environmental lawyer and a climate negotiator working as a core team member of LDC Negotiator since 2011. So he's got a lot of insights on what goes on during the negotiations. Next in our panel is Ms. Sadie DeCoste, who is a climate change researcher and activist. Sadie is also co-founder and co-director of Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, a partnership of young people around the world to raise awareness and build pressure on the impacts of climate change. Next in our panel is Mr. Harjit Singh, who is Senior Advisor for Climate Action Network. Now, we all know Harjit. He's a global expert on issues of climate impacts, mitigation, and adaptation. Harjit is also a strategic advisor at Global Partnerships to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And last but not the least, we have Adrian Martinez, who is the founder and president of La Ruta del Clima. He's currently a research fellow at IASS Potsdam, and he was granted the International Climate Protection Fellowship to research on public participation, human rights, and climate change governance. So I'm sure we have a very, very interesting discussion with so much experience and expertise and passion in the room. All right. So to start off, Dr. Boyd, can you please share with us, what are the human rights obligations of states with regard to loss and damage? How has loss and damage been reflected in your work as UNSR? And what could be done to really move the needle on loss and damage and find new sources of funding to address the issue? So all of our panelists will have 8 minutes. All right, so Dr. Boyd, take it away.
On your marks, get set, go. Thank you very much, Tetet. And I just want to reiterate what you and Sebastian have both said, that this Human Rights Council resolution recognizing the clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right, I really hope that that provides us with hope and inspiration, and hope that all of us can use that resolution in our work as a catalyst for more ambitious climate action, more ambitious environmental action, more ambitious human rights action. When we come to the issue of loss and damages, which is the question of today's seminar, I think it's really important to focus in on the fact that states do have obligations. They have obligations related to prevention, obligations related to international cooperation, and also obligations related to access to justice. And I'd really like to just start by speaking about my own personal experience as a special rapporteur. In 2019, I did my first country mission to Fiji. I went to a village called Vunidongaloa, which is one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of the impacts of climate change. You know, it used to be a waterfront, oceanside paradise with palm trees and everything that you would expect in a beautiful country like Fiji. But because of rising sea levels, storm surges, and saltwater contamination of their drinking water and their agricultural lands, they had to move inland by about 3 kilometers. And, you know, 3 kilometers may not seem like much to you or me, but for older persons, for persons with disabilities, for women with children, they are now really separated from the ocean that has been the source of their culture and their sustenance for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I also visited 2 informal settlements on the outskirts of Suva, Fiji's capital. And many of the people I met had lost their homes in Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016 and were forced to live in these very rough conditions. One of these settlements was beside the ocean, the other was beside a river, and both were subject to flooding, again, exacerbated by climate change. And the flooding would force excrement out of these basic pit toilets, contaminating their food and water supply and leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, including a major outbreak of typhoid fever while I was in Fiji. So it's really, I'm just using Fiji as an example because the people of Fiji have almost zero responsibility for causing the global climate crisis. And yet they are bearing the costs of losing their homes, relocating, and rebuilding. And this is really the epitome of climate injustice. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated in 1992 to address this global environmental threat. And there's really 3 main categories of climate action, which we're all, familiar with: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, which is really about compensating people and compensating communities for losses that are inflicted despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. And these are the costs of rebuilding homes, communities, and infrastructure. For example, after the devastating storms that have hit small island developing states in recent years, the devastating floods that hit Mozambique recently. And we also need to address non-economic losses that are inflicted, like damage to people's cultures and their livelihoods. And I think what's really upsetting, and this is really something that I'm very passionate about, is that for 29 years, we've seen a complete failure on behalf of states and businesses to adequately respond to this global crisis. Greenhouse gas emissions, which were supposed to go down, are up about 65% since 1992. Adaptation financing, grossly inadequate. And on the topic of today's discussion, loss and damage, there have been conversations going on at the United Nations for decades about this issue, but really no tangible progress. No progress that people on the ground in Dominica, in Mozambique, in Fiji, and these other frontline communities would actually feel. No money, not a penny, has changed hands from wealthy countries that are causing climate change to the least developed countries and small island states that are suffering from climate change. So let's talk about solutions. In 2008, the Maldives put forward a formal proposal to establish an international air passenger levy. In my report to the General Assembly a couple of years ago, I fully endorsed that proposal. This year, the Marshall Islands put forward a proposal for a levy on international shipping. I fully endorse that proposal as well. And I have a briefing note coming out before COP-26 that really details these 2 proposals and why they're important. So let me just summarize quickly. Greenhouse gas emissions from shipping and air travel are a small but significant and growing share of total global emissions. And for the most part, these emissions are unregulated and not covered by carbon pricing mechanisms. So we can make a compelling case that shipping and air travel emissions should be subject to the polluter pays principle through levies that are applied globally with funds dedicated to addressing loss and damage in low-income states and small island developing states. These levies would be efficient, effective, and equitable. They wouldn't stop shipping or air travel, but they would provide large and predictable flows of financing. And even if you just imagine a levy of $10 per flight at pre-COVID levels of air travel would raise $40 billion a year. A levy on shipping, what the Marshall Islands has proposed is $100 per ton. That would raise $90 billion a year. This is the magnitude of finance that we need to address the global climate crisis. The people paying the levies would be wealthy people whose actions are contributing to the crisis. The beneficiaries of these levies would be the poorest and most vulnerable people who are already suffering the devastating impacts of climate change. So these funds would empower low-income states and the small island developing states to implement actions to address loss and damage, to adapt to climate change, and would create significant employment and economic benefits in these developing countries. I want to just quickly mention a useful precedent, because in 2006, France led the establishment of a solidarity levy on air travel, using proceeds in the fight against HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis in Africa. There are 10 countries participating in this program, from Cameroon to South Korea. And this levy, which ranges from $6 per economy ticket to $60 per business ticket, raises about $300 million a year with just 10 countries. So in conclusion, my friends, it is time to push forward on these really promising initiatives that come from the small island developing states. Global air passenger travel and shipping levies to provide financing for loss and damage in low-income states and small island developing states. Let's all get together, civil society, governments, businesses, and push this through. We have a legal, moral, and ethical obligation to do so. Thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boyd, for walking us through, concrete steps that can actually be done to mobilize those resources for loss and damage. But then you also said that so far there's been no tangible progress on negotiations on loss and damage. So I'd like to call on now our friend Hafij, who is the negotiator, to enlighten us. Now, what is the current institutional framework on loss and damage under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and how or have human rights considerations actually been addressed in these mechanisms? So Hafij, the floor is yours.
Thank you, my friend teacher. And the question you raised is really important now, and we need to address. So how the human rights-based approach can be taken within the UNFCCC processes. To respond to this specific question, I would like to go back a little bit. I would like to take a bottom-up approach. What is the needs of the vulnerable communities? What is the needs of the vulnerable ecosystems? If we are clear about the needs of the ecosystems, vulnerable communities and states, then those needs can be structured within the international framework within the UNFCCC. At this moment in the UNFCCC, there is a specific institution that's called Warsaw International Mechanism that is trying to take some, I would say, some comprehensive approach to deal with loss and damage. But if we look at the needs of the communities, then what Professor White said, clearly the nature, complexity of the loss and damage that already the communities are facing. Professor White clearly identified the needs for resettlement and rehabilitation. And we all know that the complexity and challenge, legal, institutional, also technical challenge to rehabilitate a particular community, to resettle their livelihood. For example, if you would like to resettle a marine fishers community to a hilly areas, then you need to resettle the traditional livelihoods. That's the most challenging. So these are the challenges at this moment we are facing at the community level. Professor David also talked about the compensation. I would like to add with the compensation, the restoration of the ecosystems. That is the most critical issues. So with that understanding from the communities, if we now look at the existing institution policies at the UNFCCC processes, Professor Boyd again said that it's more than the decades. We are talking about the loss and damage. But at this moment, only there is a specific institute, Warsaw International Mechanism. But the mandates to regulate this Warsaw International Mechanism currently comes from UNFCCC and from the Paris Agreement, both. So it's a challenge also to regulate the same institute from different policy mandates. At the same time, it gives an opportunity to structure Warsaw International Mechanism in an innovative ways that it can address the needs of the vulnerable communities and the ecosystems. So when the Warsaw International Mechanism established and executive committee, and executive committee also further added some of the expert groups and expert committees. Now the EXCOM and the expert groups, they are trying to identify some of the innovative approaches to deal with loss and damage. For example, they are trying to share the knowledge and experience of the different vulnerable communities and what sort of approaches are needed. They are trying to identify sort of approaches. As you see under the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, we negotiated the transparency framework. In the Katowice rule book, we got some text or regulations for transparency or loss and damage. At the same time, global stock take, we got there also some language on the loss and damage. So with that said, we can move forward to develop effective institutional structure that can play an overarching role at the international level, that can connect with the national focal points, because finally we need to act at the national level. Also, you know, Santiago network was established in the last COP-25. So now we are talking of the operationalize of the Santiago network that would be providing technical assistance to even communities, vulnerable states and the ecosystem. So while we are structuring the Santiago network, then it gives another opportunity. If we can structure this network effectively, that can deliver its function efficiently. But that is a challenge, how you are now going to structure this Santiago network. Professor Boyd again identified needs for the financing for loss and damage, particularly the vulnerable developing countries. We are really serious to access the existing financial mechanisms. I do appreciate what Professor Boyd identified, the needs of the innovative finances like air passenger levy or maritime levy. But Professor Boyd, I do completely agree with you. These sort of innovative initiatives are needed, but challenge is how you would like to institutionalize those innovative financial mechanisms and entities. So that gives a big challenge for us. We all know that we established the Green Climate Fund, but how many years it has taken to establish that kind of fund? With that said, I would really urge to explore how to find the financial resources from the existing financial entities like Green Climate Fund. Again, I know we need to revert the earlier COP decision to access loss and damage finance from Green Climate Fund. But what about the other funding entities like Special Climate Change Fund, even the JEF or other adaptation? I would not say adaptation fund. We would like to share the funding with adaptation. So you see, if we can try to identify the existing financial entities to access the fund, then we need to develop innovative financial mechanism, how communities would access those funding and how the international institution would deliver those financing. So in conclusion, I would like to say that these are the overall challenges. So human rights instrument, I'm pretty sure that they also can provide some aids to structure Warsaw International Mechanism. Then what can Warsaw International Mechanism, how can take the human rights based approaches. But finally, whenever we are looking at the local level, community level, the national government needs to structure some innovative ideas. Human Rights Commission, for example, in Bangladesh, these sort of institutions really can be useful to take some innovative approaches to deal with loss and damage at the community level, also to restore the damaged ecosystem. Children, I would like to stop here. Thank you so much for hearing me. I'll be happy to respond to any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafij. And I'm sure our friends will be asking you questions given your experience in the negotiations. No, you mentioned about WIM and the current debates around, transparency of support, and also how do you operationalize the Santiago network on loss and damage to institutionalize those innovative funding mechanisms, no? But I was also in a similar webinar last Friday, and I heard that the GCF is actually running dry. No, by COP-26, the GCF won't have any money, and the developed countries are not expected to put in new money not until mid-December. So that also brings us to another question. But what I liked about what you said, Hafij, is that we should always think about the needs of the ecosystems, of communities. So at the end of the day, it's always about, you know, people and planet. Which brings me to our next panelist. Now, Sadie DeCoste, you are a young researcher and an activist. You founded the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. So my big question is why? And how do the youth see loss and damage related to climate justice? And do you have specific demands for COP26? So Sadie, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of intergenerational justice as it relates to loss and damage. So we all know that loss and damage from climate change is happening now. We see it in the news. In my hometown, Vancouver, in my home province in Canada, there was one of the worst heat waves they've ever seen this summer, and they broke the record for the highest temperature ever recorded in Canada multiple days in a row. And in that heat wave, around 700 people died tragically. And this is, this is something that's not just occurring in my country, it's occurring all over the world. And especially impacting communities who are living in poverty, for example, and in the global South. The estimated cost of loss and damage in 2020, this is just one estimate, was that it cost around $200 billion US dollars in economic damages. Now, obviously, economic damages don't cover the damages to things like how do you practice your traditional culture when your island goes underwater, or how do you deal with if it serves kind of as a proxy for like how climate disasters are affecting the world. There's another cost estimate of loss and damage for the future. And I'm inviting you to think about the world in 2050. In 2050, one estimate says that loss and damage will cost between 1 and 2 trillion US dollars. So that's 5 to 10 times more economic damage from climate change than we saw last year. And if that's a proxy for how much more severe the climate impacts are going to be, it does make me fear for my future. In 2050, I'll be in my 50s. Many people on this call will still be alive. It's about 30 years from now, and yeah, even then, we're already seeing a world that we're not sure is going to be safe, depending on how kind of the tipping points and depending on how we're also able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So on this notion of intergenerational justice, I have a quick graphic that I want to share. I'm hoping that you guys can see this graphic, but I might make it just a little bit bigger. So this graphic is showing the scale of unborn generations. Looking 50,000 years into the past, we see that there's 100 billion people who've lived on Earth that have died. And there are currently around 7.7 billion people who are alive today. If we're looking at future generations, there are supposedly going to be 6.75 trillion people in unborn future generations. And this is based on the UN estimate that average births per year will stabilize at 135 million in the 21st century. This graphic is from the book called The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World by Roman Krznaric. I didn't pronounce that well. But basically what I'm trying to show here is that if we are caring about future generations, which I believe that we all should, given that we view human lives equally, then we should care equally about the lives of people who've yet to be born as the lives that are currently on Earth. Then if we're leaving this unsafe world to future generations, and yet there are so many more people to come in the future than are currently living on Earth, that we're creating a world that is going to be unsafe for them, and that violates their human rights. I'm going to stop sharing my screen again now. So what rights do we owe future generations? I believe we owe them a right to survival, a right to safety on this planet, a right to living in dignity, not living in poverty, to be able to access basic services and be able to pursue a good life and follow the things that they're most interested in, and to be living in a society that's fair and equal for people, where the circumstances of your birth are not affecting whether you're able to have safety or dignity. And so I'm asking people to think really explicitly about intergenerational justice when we talk about loss and damage. I think we all know this is an issue. We talk about historical responsibility, polluters pay, intergenerational justice. Obviously, the campaigning by youth has been very influential because we're able to say, look, it's our future, and think about us, think about what kind of world you're leaving to us. But I don't think we think enough beyond 2050. We don't think about people who will be living in 70 years, in 100 years, in 300 years. There are ways to gear decision-making toward long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking. There have been some interesting ways to do that. One has been in Japan. They were doing some community consultations on what they wanted their community to look like, and they asked half of the participants to participate as themselves and half of them to participate as people from the year 2060, and they asked those people to dress up in special robes and pretend that they were people living in the future. And what they found was the people who participated as themselves in this era made decisions that were more short-term and more oriented toward things that would make their own lives better in the short term. But the people from the future made decisions around policy or investment in their hypothetical community scenario that were better for society as a whole, that created a better life for people. So I think explicitly asking people to think about the kind of world we want in the future is important. A second example of something you could do to really explicitly recognize intergenerational justice is to leave an empty chair at a table that represents future generations, literal physical chair at a table when you're, say, holding an event, and as a prompt to think about, okay, like what would people want if they were able to have a say in the decisions we're making now for their future? What would they want? And I think that kind of long-term thinking is not considered in the current policy debates around loss and damage. So yeah, I'm imploring people to think seriously about the world that we're leaving to young people, to get their act together and think about what, we all care about our children, but how are our children going to actually live on Earth? And that kind of brings me to the demands of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. We, of course, they're more focused into the negotiations, into kind of what's happening now on loss and damage policy. But I think they were made with future generations and young people in mind. So the first demand is to stop the delay, denial, and blocking of progress on loss and damage, to act now and take it seriously, because for too long it's been obfuscated by politicians who just want to delay. The second demand is to make loss and damage a priority by appointing a loss and damage champion who will take forward the issue and make sure that progress is made. The third is to pledge $1 trillion in finance for loss and damage over the next 5 years. $1 trillion feels like a big amount, but again, if you're looking at an estimated cost of 200 billion a year times 5, that's $1 trillion. Let's wrap our heads around these numbers. It's a big number, but people are suffering from loss and damage already, and they're going, to continue to suffer. The fourth is to tax big polluters to pay for loss and damage. As Dr. Boyd mentioned, levies, taxes on shipping and aviation, fossil fuel extraction tax, all of these ideas that really follow the make polluters pay principle. And the next is to operationalize a Santiago network on loss and damage that works for people and communities and actually reaches people on the ground, rather than being just another website or practice of talking about loss and damage. And the final demand, which links more to what I was talking about, is to center youth voices in the loss and damage negotiations, listen to our perspectives, and really incorporate them when you're actually making decisions about loss and damage. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Sadie, for educating us on why the youth are fighting for the right to imagine a future, no? And those demands that you mentioned, very, very clear, spot on. Now, the big question mark is how we are going to really, mobilize enough strength to get these policymakers to listen to our demands. Which brings me to our next speaker, Harjeet. So Harjeet, for you, we have two big burning questions. One would be, what are the limits currently with regard the ability of financial support for loss and damage to contribute to human rights? And of course, we'd like to hear from you, what would be the expectations for COP-26 on loss and damage?
Thank you, Tatat, and thank you, CIL, for organizing this session. Great to be part of such a brilliant panel. And a lot has been said. So when you've asked me these questions, Tatat, I'm wondering what to say. So let me try and add something to all the brilliant points that have my co-panelists have made. So when you ask about the limits and how we can contribute, I think we need to, as everybody said before me, we need to clearly look at what is preventing us to contribute to human rights when it comes to loss and damage. And that is the political will. It's not lack of money. As Sadie just said, money is there. Financial crisis in the previous decades and the recent response to the pandemic told us that trillions could be organized in no time. And here we are fighting for 100 billion. And we know what kind of fudging and all kinds of manipulation happens to even project that rich countries are already providing $100 billion or $80 billion. That's what they're claiming, but for mitigation adaptation. But in reality, it's full of loans guarantees. And here we are also asking for money for communities who are already suffering from climate impacts. And rich countries do not really want to accept their responsibility, their liability that they have towards these communities who are suffering. So as Hafiz said, we fought for an institution. It was a long fight. As David and Hafiz both reminded, that it has been going on for 30 years. But in the last few years, we are able to have that institution. But in reality, that institution is not being made to deliver because of all kinds of arm twisting and bullying that's happening, which is preventing from this institution to really function. So the action and support is one of the functions of this institution, but they did not allow it to make progress so that finance can be mobilized. All the words that we say, that we stand in solidarity with communities who are suffering, that you keep hearing that from rich countries now, more as their citizens are also hit, which is really sad. And all the sympathies and empathies we have for communities who suffered major disasters also in the global north. But in reality, the rich countries have resources to help those communities recover from the losses, and they have those systems in place. But for developing countries, they do not have such resources. And they are facing loss and damage, as David very eloquently said, that it's because of the inaction that we have seen over the last 3 decades. Mitigation is insufficient, adaptation support is inadequate, and that has piled up all the climate impacts for communities now, and as Sadie keeps reminding, in terms of intergenerational rights for communities in future. So I'll remind everybody that what we are facing today are unavoided and unavoidable climate impacts. So they have become unavoidable because of decades of inaction that we have seen. And again, going back to the point David made on non-economic losses, it is such a moral responsibility. No amount of money will be able to repair the harm. And that the whole range of non-economic losses, which includes displacement and loss of culture, loss of heritage, biodiversity loss, this is going to be irreversible in so many ways. And it makes an even more compelling case for action now and to help communities who are suffering now. So when we demand for loss and damage finance, they point us towards humanitarian aid. And humanitarian aid, one, it's for all kinds of disasters. And what is the total kitty of humanitarian aid every year? It's $30 billion. And who gets that money? There's so much of geopolitics, there's so much of trade relations that come into play when they provide humanitarian aid. And here we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. As Sadie said, we need $290 to $500 billion per year by 2030. That's the kind of loss and damage we are going to see. And when we talk about human rights, it's not about choosing who gets support. Human right is given the moment you're born as human being, and we are also fighting for the rights of ecosystem. So when it comes to how loss and damage can contribute, we need a system. We cannot depend on whims and fancies of rich countries who are responsible for the crisis. They have to help create a system, and that's what we are fighting for when we are going to the COP. We need several options. And as David said, air passenger levy, in fact, that reminds me that in Action Aid in 2019, when I was there, we worked on a report, how market solutions that have been put. Insurance is one when we talk about loss and damage finance that they have put on the table. But in reality, insurance doesn't help. We are looking at world beyond insurance. Insurance has only a little role to play, and all kinds of green bonds and other options have been put on the table. And we analyzed all those options against 5 human rights. Because of the lack of time, I won't go into all the details, but they did talk about clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and intergenerational justice, and remedies for loss and damage, differentiated responsibility, and so on. But what we found that is important, that none of the market solutions could stand that human rights test. And what could pass? Of course, the state support that has to come, better budgeting, shifting fossil fuel subsidies, and what David was referring to, a range of innovative financing options which are based on progressive taxation, whether it's air passenger levy, climate damages tax, financial transaction tax. We need to look at those options which can contribute to realization of human rights. And that's why when we go to the COP, we want that political recognition of this gap that exists to create a system for loss and damage finance, so that we are not depending on rich countries every year or every time when there's a crisis. And we want that channel to be established so that people are able to access it as their right. And it has to be included in the new finance goals starting 2025. And of course, everything that Hafiz said on Santiago Network and so on. So we are going with a very clear demand. As civil society, we are united. We are working. So I'm representing Climate Action Network. We are working closely with LDYC, Loss and Damage Collaboration, and many of our allies to make that unified demand. And we are going to have a consultation in the next 1 hour, 15 minutes. So discussing exactly that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Harjeet. And it sounds like for civil society, loss and damage is going to be the make or break issue at COP26, right? Let's see. Let's put up that.
You're on mute, Tata.
Oh, thanks so much. And I'm sure a lot of our friends would have some questions for you come Q&A time. But now let me go and call on Adrian Martinez. Adrian, from civil society perspective, how can human rights inform loss and damage? Yeah. And from a Latin American perspective, what are your priorities on loss and damage and human rights?
Sure.
Take it away.
I think one of the things that we should always take on count is that what is missing, and I think what we're all talking about is that there is not a human rights-based approach on climate action within the UNFCCC. There's not a systemic integration of human rights in general in the three pillars of the Paris Agreement. Even though, for example, the Paris Agreement in its preamble mentions human rights, therefore you can interpret the agreement in light of it. And in the rules and so on of the UNFCCC and the Paris agreements, there is human rights related language. And beyond that, human rights law and human rights of the obligation of countries to guarantee and enable people to exercise and enjoy their human rights in general, it's applicable to anything related to, for example, the adverse effects of climate change or anything related to reducing emissions. So it's there. There is an obligation. It's totally connected to human rights. But what happens is that, in fact, when there is a governance process of it, governance do not address it, and we are focused on conversations about money and conversation about political will, and the conversation of legal responsibility and obligations in terms of human rights and the rights of people and how are they being affected are not considered, even though equity and responsibility are overriding principles of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Those are not included. So and in the issue of loss and damage, when we have Article 8 and how it's been addressed, especially not only the part of minimizing and averting, but especially the part of addressing loss and damage, it is just being addressed in a systematically different than everything else within the Paris Agreement. So it's being dealt with no finance, is systematically excluded from the main processes, and it has a specific rule to prevent countries to talk about liability and compensation in regards to climate impacts, especially in loss and damage. And this is very important because there's two key issues in regards to human rights that go beyond just the impacts that loss and damage has to pretty much every single human right that we have: housing, education, life, food, water, and so on. But the fact that climate change is unjustly affecting those that are most vulnerable, unjustly affecting those that have the least regarding to the causes of climate change, that they're not having a systemic response, that they are unable to access justice because of it. And structurally, the UNFCCC and Paragraph 51 of Decision 1 of COP-21 has a decision that tries to avoid liability and a form of reparation, that is compensation. So structurally, the countries within the UNFCCC process of governance are trying to avoid responsibility and ignore human rights obligations in terms of climate impacts. So it's not only that we have to push for real and push for finance, it's that we have to remind them that there are obligations that are completely applicable from human rights law and international law in their work. And that is something that is not happening, and that is something that we should push forward. And that's something that human rights NGOs could totally help, and we should strongly push, because the system itself is built to avoid this discussion on responsibility and obligations. And as our colleague says, it is not enough, for example, to just depend on litigation, because there's lots of things that we can do through human rights litigation and international law, but the scale of the issue that we're talking about requires a structural response of states. And that is what the states are supposed to do to guarantee human rights in any type of issue. And the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is the mechanisms to do that. And it is not working. And it is not working not because of ignorance, is not working because of political strategy and so on. And we can trace it back to the creation of the UNFCCC and the creation of the Paris Agreement. As everybody said, what we need is a financial mechanism, what we need is compensation, what we need is to assist directly the communities that are most vulnerable, not through loans, not through profiting through insurance, but through direct addressing it and help to those communities that are unjustly and disproportionately affected. And that has systematically been obstructed by the United States and other countries, developed countries that want to avoid responsibility on the issue of the causes of climate change and the impacts that they're causing on the most vulnerable. And that is history, and that's what it's there since 3 decades ago. So including the discussion of human rights from the point of view of obligation, and the point of view of making decisions and policy decisions on a human rights approach and taking into account the systemic integration principle is super important. And finally, to talk about the Latin American perspective, I think there's 2 levels. First, it's super important that we take this idea of obligations and how to bring it also to the national level, because at the end, in our community, those that are most vulnerable are communities that are already on conditions of vulnerability and that are part of the structures and systems that countries they have to fix also. So making this a priority at the national level, there is an interdependency with what we do at the international level. So that's something that we have to bring home. And in many cases is what is being reflected or not being reflected in the narratives of our countries in Latin America, because many of them lack a strong position on loss and damage. And that is something that has to change, because they have to acknowledge that not only that they have an obligation, but they have the obligation also to defend the rights of people, especially from big polluters and their communities, because not only small countries like mine in Costa Rica and in Central America lack the funding, and they require from their political representatives to go and defend their human rights not only in the courts, but also in the governance sphere, such as the UNFCCC. And that's something that is lacking. We need a major push from our countries to defend the enjoyment of our rights. And I guess basically that's my message of how I think, things should be maybe positioned and how the human rights community could help propel this issue more strongly. And I guess also from a Latin American perspective, there's many regions such as mine that is extremely vulnerable to climate impacts. And just as David Boyd mentioned, we are very least responsible on this issue, but the challenge and the effect to, for example, our right to development, our right to imagine a future, it's being obstructed, and it is an existential crisis. It is a human rights violation, and it is something that we have to sort of move beyond just negotiating on a paragraph based on what is possible, but negotiating on what is the right of people and what is human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It is so inspiring not to hear such powerful words and analysis from all our panelists. And I like Adrian's point about, we need to recognize that there are already pre-existing vulnerabilities that make people even more vulnerable to climate impacts. And that is why there is a need for structural and systemic solutions that would really go at the roots and go at the heart of injustice. No, it's fundamentally a question of justice or injustice. So thank you very much for those very powerful words from all our panelists. And as Adrian catches his breath, I'd like to go back to our first panelist, Dr. Boyd, and for all the panelists as well. No, I'll be throwing the first question for all of you. You have 1 minute to respond to it. So maybe the question now is, what are your expectations from human rights advocacy groups and institutions to support the work, to support our collective work? Yeah, Dr. Boyd, take it away.
Thanks, Tatet. I think that human rights organizations and civil society have like a really major role to play in this. We've just witnessed what the power of civil society can be when people come together behind a common cause. The campaign to have the United Nations recognize the right to a healthy environment had over 1,300 civil society organizations from around the world that came together and supported that global call. That kind of unified voice cannot be ignored by the states that have these legal obligations to act on climate change. So I would love to see a similar kind of coming together of over 1,000 organizations to push for real, tangible progress on loss and damages. Not institutions, not mechanisms, money going from the north to the south. period.
Short and sweet from Dr. Boyd. Hafid, your views, please.
What David said is very clear. The North needs to provide the finance to the South and the vulnerable developing countries. So in terms of addressing loss and damage, compensation approach would be the heart of the policy approaches. But at the same time, we need to address also damage to ecology. We need technical, also capacity building support. That's it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, Sadie, please.
Yeah, so I think I agree with what the other panelists said. You know, short and simple, we need loss and damage finance, and we need everyone who can to advocate for it. I would add to that and say, use the words loss and damage. Don't just say climate change, because the issue gets so marginalized that people are trying not to talk about it. Use the words loss and damage, and if you can, talk about our responsibilities toward future generations and use examples of how loss and damage is happening now.
Thanks so much. Harjeet?
Well, I'll build on what Sadie, Hafiz, and David said. A lot of awareness is required to connect the issue of loss and damage and human rights. To put it very simply, we have to take this message to our countries, to other civil society organizations, to general public, that if we don't help communities who are suffering now, their human rights get violated. And all of us have a responsibility for developed countries to increase their climate action across the board, mitigation, providing support for adaptation, and also create a system so that these people can be supported. And developing countries also have to step up. They have to make sure they do everything that they can to protect the human rights and promote human rights of people who are at risk of these climate impacts. So we have to look at the issue of loss and damage through climate change and human rights, through human rights lens. Thank you.
And Adrian?
I think for me, it would be two comments. It would be awesome if the human rights community could pressure countries and sort of integrate what they do in the human rights sort of arena. For example, many of our countries in Latin America are very outspoken on human rights, but then in the climate change, they're very silent on loss and damage, which is one of the main implications or main connectors between those two communities. That would be very important. And I guess also to escalate the issue in terms of obligations. I know many people are afraid of calling about responsibility, calling about obligations, because the Paris Agreement is sort of voluntary and it's this collective voluntary framework. But then again, let's not be afraid of calling out our rights. Let's not be afraid of trying to exercise and defend justice and call for equity and call for those principles that are within the UNFCCC. And that is something that we love support from the human rights community, to be able, not only at the courts, but where we can get the structural reforms, where we can get the actual money to aid people that are being adversely impacted by climate change. And I think to have this justice approach, this right-based approach, is super important. And I hopefully we can join in this effort.
Okay, thank you so much. You heard our panelists, but this webinar ain't over yet. Now's your chance to raise your questions to our experts. And I think we have 2 questions already in the Q&A box. So the first is from Pierre. So many thanks for the dynamic interventions. How can the resolution voted by the UNHCR on Friday concretely leverage at COP-26 both the operationalization of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage and emphasis on loss and damage finance? So that's the first question. And then the second question coming from Mathilde to Adrian and Dr. Boyd. What is one structural change measure that can help muster political will from rich countries and not continuing the history of countries obstructing the L&D process? So think about those questions, and anyone from our panelists could respond to any of these questions. Who'd like to take the first shot, dear panelists?
I could answer it, and then maybe Dr. Boyd can also answer the second question. I think if we take and I really love the historical approach to everything. If we take a historical approach from loss and damage, it's not that there is a lack of proposal of how to transform the governance process or create mechanisms or alternatives of funding to address loss and damage. And so the proposals for structural change that we had for the past 30 years, many are very similar that we have now. They might be a little bit modern, more adjusted to the frameworks that we have, but they're there. So what we need is it's a political pressure on the moments of decision making that countries, developed countries, have to make this to sort of give in to the proposals that we're making for these mechanisms that we're suggesting, to open the windows that we're requesting, to admit to the degree of finance that we have. So we have the proposals either in the past and currently of how to do structural change to do this, but we have to pressure developed countries to accept that it's their responsibility, that it's a legal responsibility. And there's also the issue of paragraph 51, which is sort of, I mean, it's just an interpretive decision, but it's there and we can work around it. It's not that we cannot, but it sort of plays out to the basic idea that developed countries do not want to be responsible for loss and damage. And until we break that down in any way possible, until we make them acknowledge that it is a responsibility, we will not go out from this this game of trying to have funny or different platforms to sort of do something without money and just keep going to circle decades and decades. We need to make them acknowledge that it's a legal responsibility because there is harm that is being done and that individuals have the rights to get reparation and to be treated justly. And that is something that is not acknowledged by the UNFCCC. It's not acknowledged by parties. And until we break that down, either by reinterpreting paragraph 51, having a new declaration where it's something like, so where responsibility is acknowledged and liability is acknowledged by developed countries, and money flows because of this, because there has been harm done to people unjustly, we won't have a real structural change as we have suggested, and many NGOs and many countries have proposed during decades, during the whole process.
But that's precisely the problem, Adrian. The rich countries are allergic to liability and compensation. So what kind of a push? No, I think they really look at the Declaration of Human Rights more in a punitive light, rather, that's why they try to evade responsibility rather than positive, that action XYZ can help realize these rights, no? But yeah, they're super allergic to that. Harjeet, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, let me try and add something to what Adrian very rightly said, that I think we need to fundamentally change the discourse, and what we achieved just recently gives us a tool to do that. If you look at how we have crafted Paris Agreement, and I have a problem with the term nationally determined contribution. Imagine you are dealing with a global crisis and you are trying to do what is convenient to do based on your national circumstances and politics. But when you needed to mobilize billions and trillions, you could do that. So clearly, they have not taken the whole aspect of climate action as their responsibility and obligation. They're doing what is convenient. And the moment you put human rights at the center, the moment we change the discourse, that however inconvenient they feel, however hard they try to evade responsibility, we need to remind them that they've signed human rights principles, and when you leave the people to suffer, their human rights are violated. It is your responsibility as a national government and also as a global citizen and all the entire global community that signed those human rights principles and declaration. I think we need to change the discourse. I mean, to tell them it's their obligation, and the recent developments really help us point and make more pointed efforts towards putting human rights at the center of our work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Harjeet. I'm not quite sure if Dr. Boyd is already back. He seemed to have dropped off. Okay, so while we're waiting for him to come back, maybe we could go to the next question from Julia. As a youth organization from the Global North advocating for climate justice, what do we have to pay attention to in order to achieve our common goals in a just manner? Also at COP-26 specifically. So maybe Sadie, you would want to help us out in this?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things I would say here. The first is that it's important to stand in solidarity with youth from the Global South. And I think that actually the COP is a really unique forum to do so, because you actually, if you are attending COP, you meet people from all over the world, youth from all over the world, but also, in many online or kind of like more distributed networks, people are calling for global climate justice. So understanding what the demands are of youth from the Global South. And I think you'll find it is very centered around, like what are the rights of people to live a, safe and happy life. I think the other thing I would say is that it's important to use the influence you have with your own governments. Like, for example, in my experience, I'm Canadian. When I go to COP, I get often a meeting with officials from the Canadian government, and I always use that opportunity to push for the demands on loss and damage. Because obviously they're the ones, coming from the Global North, they're the ones that hold the power. And so we don't only need, we do need to amplify the voices of Global South youth and their experiences, perspectives, and stories. But we also need a strong movement of people in the Global North pressuring the governments that are most responsible for causing climate change and also who will need to pay the costs of it. So I would say, get in touch with those governments and keep pressuring them on the issues.
Thanks, Sadie. Now I'd like to go back to Hafid. It seems like Dr. Boyd has already left the call. Super busy guy. So maybe you could respond to the first question around how do we leverage, this decision from the UNHCHR to both operationalize the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage and also, to emphasize on loss and damage finance, or does it have any effect at all?
Yeah, that's a critical question, actually. You see, Harjeet was talking about the NDC. There's the paradigm shift from the legal to voluntary approach. That was more than in the Paris Agreement. Para 50, one of the ones that excluded the liability and compensation approaches that provided us additional burden. So accepting this reality in the climate negotiation process, so Santiago Network, how we can build up or structure the Santiago Network that can assist the vulnerable communities and states. So when we are going to at COP26, so we are trying to do some work how this Santiago Network can be structured effectively so that it can deliver the technical assistance to the vulnerable communities and the states. At the same time, we are also thinking how this Santiago Network can access the existing financial resources, also can take some innovative financial mechanisms to address the loss and damage. So at this moment is very critical, that particularly least developing countries wanted to establish this Santiago Network with an ambition of establishing an implementation arm. If Santiago Network can be established an implementation arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism, because even when we established the Warsaw International Mechanism, we thought about that it could be a broader mechanism. That is not only the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism. So there is executive committee, Now, if we can structure the Santiago network as an implement arm that can be really a coordinated approach, then hopefully we can get some good procedural decision at COP26. Thank you.
Hafid, you were breaking up in the last minutes of your intervention, but maybe I'd like to do a follow-up question to that, no? Because there seems to be different visions as far as the Santiago network is concerned. You know, when you're speaking as a developing country negotiator, it seems to me that there's a lot riding in the Santiago network, but from from the rich countries, it seems to me like the Santiago network is just going to be like a clearinghouse, a website that could provide information coming from different sources. So how do we make sure, that the vision of developing countries for the Santiago network will be the one that would take, precedence rather than just what did Colin say from Practical Action? It's a brokering house, no? That it's a clearing house. So how do we do that? A meaningful Santiago network.
That's a very good question. That is the challenge. If you look at the understanding and the approach, those are taken by the developed country parties. What you said, they are taking as very simple as a network. So it might be a clearinghouse. Their position is really very light. On the other hand, vulnerable developing countries, we are taking it very seriously, as I said earlier, as an implementation arm. So as an implementation arm that can be structured very widely. We have some precedents within the UNFCCC. If you look at the CTCN, I'm not supporting the idea of CTCN to establish for loss and damage under WIMA Santiago network, but we can learn from the CTCN. CTCN takes a holistic approach, even it has some limitations. So in terms of developing an effective network, we need to understand what sort of structure is really needed to deliver the technical assistance at the community level. That's the challenge. So you see the difference between the two parties, I would say, developed and developing countries. Then we need to compromise at COP26. But I would say we vulnerable developing countries, we need to do huge homework so that we can provide some right approaches, right structure to be decided at COP26. Thank you.
All right. I just mentioned Colin, and there he is. A question in the chat box. No, Colin is asking, any one of the panelists can respond to this. Do we need a UN special envoy on loss and damage? And what would be their priorities? What do you think? Any one of you may respond.
Teacher, can I respond? So, Colin, we all know that this is now a good discussion going on to appoint UN special envoy for loss and damage. But this is a good idea, but we need to be clear what would be the function of this special envoy and what he would deliver. Actually, first question. Then second question, what would be the connection between UN appointed envoy with the UNFCCC processes? How he or she would influence the UNFCCC processes? Third question is how that envoy would be treated within the UNFCCC governance system. So if we can actually explore these three questions, that would really help us to agree or disagree on this idea. But at this moment, it's a good idea. We can discuss further. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Is there an appetite to have a UN special envoy? Harjeet, you know more.
Well, what I hear is that UK government lost but they kept delaying it, and they should have put the application well before. And now to achieve that in the next few weeks is not going to be possible. But this is definitely one of the key demands that we have, and I think we need to keep pushing for it and have an envoy. As Sadie also mentioned, we need a champion or envoy to make sure that there's a spotlight on this very issue. There's a lot of work that needs to happen, and unless there is a political will, unless we have somebody who pulls things together, it will not happen. So we definitely need to make that happen. But UK government has been a real laggard. We had several meetings with the presidency to push that, but they just did not show much interest to make that happen.
All right, so we have 2 more questions here from our friends, but before that, Sadie wants to say something on that.
If I may, I think that the idea of a special envoy on loss and damage is good. I think any additional accountability, research, line of inquiry about loss and damage will shed more attention on the issue. But I'm also I'm critical of the idea that this can all be solved within the system, because I think at the end of the day, the people with power don't care. Like they've just shown that they don't care, and that's depressing. But I think that we need to push back. We need something bigger than just a UN special envoy. We need a social movement. We need like people coming together to say, no, we won't accept this, that you don't care. We need you to act as if our lives mattered. So yeah, I think we need more than just that. We need everyone. We need the public to understand what loss and damage is. I think they understand it, but they don't understand how decisions are made around it. That's all.
All right, thank you so much for that view that you offered. Hold that hand, and Adrian, because there's another question specifically for you, I think. No, what do existing human rights treaties and obligations say about the role of non-state polluters and climate wreckers in relation to loss and damage? Because developed nations often pass the blame onto the private sector, private finance sector, banks, asset managers. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the issue, it depends if we start focusing on litigation or if we're talking about the UNFCCC. In terms of litigation, for example, from the Inter-American Human Rights Court, transboundary responsibility on environmental damage can be applicable to climate change and loss and damage. That is something that they have talked about in I think 2 years ago. I think the pandemic already made me forget how long it was, but about 2 years ago in terms of transboundary responsibility, and that's something that is also very relevant to the issue of climate change, because it addresses whoever is under their jurisdiction and that is causing harm that can be applicable to businesses. But I think also the issue with trying only to focus on bigger meters and just what can be done in courts, it's very, I mean, it can push for political pressure, but it does not create the structural change needed. So it has to be a tool of a political movement and a strategy within the UNFCCC framework to create solutions. So it's very important also to try to use those tools and to apply the human rights treaties and obligations and so on when it's possible, especially when courts are progressive enough to recognize that and to help country to country are responsible to the emissions and the harms that are being done within their jurisdiction, even if the company is European or so on. But there is those limitations. There's efforts also to have more legal opinions on this, having consultations in the International Court of Justice. There is a collective, and I think Vanuatu is leading this sort of effort to have more robust legal opinions, and that is great. That's sort of that's more tools that we have to do this transformative change that has to be done in the climate regime, because we're talking about a global, an ecosystem-wide, economic-wide, a development-wide an issue that is generating harm. It's not just a company, it's all of many companies across the board generating transboundary harm. So it's something that can only be solved collectively in an international arena. And and talking to what Sadie says, and now that's the hand I raised, what I'm afraid is that loss and damage becomes a status quo, like poverty is or colonialism is, things that we just accept because I was born in Central America, you were born in some country in Africa or in Southeast Asia, and that's what you have to do because that's you. That's what you're being assigned. And the issue with loss and damage is that it's not what my grandparents used to experience when they saw a hurricane or when they saw a drought. It's not something that is done by nature just because that's it. It's your luck. No, this is done because of the actions of an economic system of people that have profited on emissions, that have created harm, and they have enjoyed the emissions while they're at the same time creating harm to others unjustly. And that is something I cannot accept. I cannot accept this becoming a status quo and something that me and everybody living in my region has to just accept as a thing. And that is why it has to be a political movement. That is why it's not enough just to go to court, because I cannot go to court for every single community that is being affected by climate change. I cannot just live in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights fighting for every single impact that we're suffering. We require a structural change based on responsibility, based on our right to justice and our right to reparation. And that is something that can only be done within the climate regime system. Thank you.
Wow, this is becoming to be a very interesting conversation. Now we're learning a lot. Now we have this question for all panelists. No, I know we only have about 8 or 9 minutes to this webinar. So maybe if you can keep your responses short. But the question is, it's actually a combination of a comment and the question. No? It seems that a lot of actors, CSOs and institutions are failing to embrace messages on loss and damage due to perceived politicization of the issue and the absence of perspective. How do we break this perception and bring all actors to rally behind the voices representing those most impacted? Big question for our panelists. So while you think about that, maybe I could also throw in the last question coming from Joy. Are we demanding the G20 address loss and damage and human rights just in advance of the COP? Yeah, so big questions. Harjeet can try to respond.
Well, I would say that we should not worry about politicization of the issue. In fact, we should politicize the issue. It is about politics. It's about geopolitics. It's about political economy. And we want, in fact, this is our main target as civil society. We want to politicize the issue of loss and damage at this COP because it is not being discussed at the political level. That's why, just the fight is around technicalities and jargons. We need to really grow beyond. And some negotiators and countries would like to even say, oh, finance is a very difficult issue. Equity is a very toxic issue. Everything that matters is either contentious or difficult or toxic. Now you bring human rights, they'll say, oh my God, now you have brought another issue. Please don't politicize it. So don't worry about it. In fact, embrace the politicization of the issue. That's exactly what we are working towards. We want leaders to look at loss and damage as their failure. The reason communities are facing climate crisis because these politicians did not understand the political need of responding to the climate crisis. It's their failure of 30 years that has led to that situation. So it is a bloody political issue. Let us go for it.
Let's make it political because it is political, no? We're sick and tired of being locked in technical debates that don't really come out to, meaningful solutions. let's save the negotiator for the last. Yeah, Hafid. So maybe I can go to Sadie now. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I understand this concern. I think that one way I agree with what Harjeet said. Like, you can't avoid it. It's, you know, it's the way it is. You could maybe ask the rich countries why they're politicizing it and not just doing what needs to be done. But but I think one technique that I use when I'm talking to someone and they say, oh, it's difficult, you know, like it's just time, you know, the budgets are tough with COVID and, you know, like whatever excuses they're giving, is turn to a story, an example of loss and damage, and be like, hey, like, you know, like this many people were displaced in this event. Like, this is real for them right now. I know, you know, like, bring it to stories. If you have personal stories, use those, and then kind of make it a which side are you on? There's that old protest song, which side are you on? Just ask them, you know, like, you don't have to ask that, but yeah, I think bringing it back to like, oh, what do the people that we're fighting for, like people who are facing these impacts, what do they need? And that is finance.
From my perspective, and I was talking with a loss and damage negotiator from Latin America some days ago, and we were talking about liability, paragraph 51, and all those things, and his response was, well, that was settled. I mean, that's what we agreed, and that's the status quo, and that's what we have. And I mean, one of the things that it just strikes me is that, yeah, but climate change and loss and damage especially is not a political issue only, it's a fact issue. It is happening and it is actually affecting people. So it's not like a metaphysical sort of theoretical issue. It's a real thing, tangible, measurable thing that is happening. And then my answer to him is like, yeah, I mean, you have to structure, but it is completely not working. And we have discussing about this for 3 decades or more, and you have known about this for more time, and still you are sort of just complacent with having a system that is unjust and that is not working. So, I mean, it is completely political. It is completely political for those who oppose it, but it is also a fact. It is a fact-based issue. It's not a technical issue. It's not only about who creates the, I don't know, an assessment tool only or so on. It is, there's people that are dying and their communities are being destroyed. So it's something that we have to tackle as a reality. And as Sadie said, about testimonies and about rights and about people. And when you start doing this, then this story about, I mean, but yeah, we decided and sort of this is what all we have becomes very absurd, because they know it's not working, and they know that it's unjust, and they know that it's creating harm. So when we just sort of analyze this idea of the will of parties and the status quo, then it becomes something very dark that is very hard to defend with just being silent, which is what many negotiators do from countries such as mine, for example, because we are also in something that has to acknowledge that we're in terms of politics, we are locked into a dependency relationship with many developed countries, and for not only for climate change finance, for mitigation and adaptation, but for many other development issues. And sort of asking for your rights turns to be a challenge, because then you have to worry about what is the negative economic response in other issues from this country. So let's ignore that we have vulnerable populations that require us to defend their rights, because we want also to have good partners for development. And then these people, and as in Chile, they call this sacrifice zones. And it's sort of being applied also to that communities that are enduring loss and damage. They're just being sacrificed because you are silent and not defending their rights, because you're afraid, because you depend on developed countries, and it's easier just to be silent and accept the status quo. And I don't want, and as I say, I don't want this something that becomes acceptable. It is not acceptable, and it cannot be the new reality of our communities, especially communities that are already enduring so many other things. due to so many other structural issues. And that is why it has to be political, because it's a right issue, because it exists, and because it is systemically harming people.
And talk about political issues, Hafid. I've seen how rich country negotiators were ganging up on developing country negotiators, no? So what do you say about this being a very political issue?
Tita, you might recall that in Paris, the loss and damage negotiators from vulnerable developing countries, we are really upset to accept that para that Arjana said, para 51 of the law CP21, that excluded compensational liability. So, but still, we think that is not the end. We can revert that decisions. Maybe it will take many years, but we can take that technical approach again to revert that one. While I do accept the political reality at the UNFCCC processes, why don't we take a bottom-up approach? Why don't we establish at the national level compensation approach? Each and every vulnerable countries, we can take some human rights based approach to address loss and damage, and we can develop some compensation approach like compensation fund. And some of the countries like Bangladesh is thinking about national mechanism to address loss and damage. That sort of national mechanism can establish a compensation fund. So we can identify the vulnerable communities, victims, and we can think about to providing the compensation to those victims. And then the vulnerable states can come up with this evidence-based policy approach at the international level. Hey, this is the reality. So we need to revert back the compensation approach in the UNFCCC processes. It sounds very ambitious. As a negotiator, I do accept it, but still we need some academic and civil society campaign approach. So we can move forward with this idea. It will take time, but we can do it.
All right, my friends, thank you so much for all of those wonderful insights that you have shared and the wonderful questions coming from our participants. Time flies when you're having so much fun, no? So didn't realize that 1 hour and a half, 90 minutes is already over. It's been a very, very productive, engaging conversation. Don't you think so? No, coming from the decision last Friday, we should really, build on this momentum so that we can all keep on organizing, we can keep on mobilizing, because indeed, loss and damage is a very political issue. We have to make polluters pay. We have to make sure that the rights of everyone, including those who are yet to be born, will be realized, will be fulfilled, will be upheld. So thank you so much to all our panelists. A round of applause for everyone. Yeah. And of course, a round of applause for all our friends who joined us for this webinar today. And climate justice now. Until the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks all of you.
All right.